Actually, most of the programs that we have here are taped, so that if you do miss them, you are able then to watch them on one of our many DVDs of such programs. So, Lauren, do you think Dick is set, or does he have to come back in? Okay. Well, good afternoon again. I'm Gwynn Pfeiffer, and on behalf of the New Canaan Library, with 6 days to go until the daylight savings, I welcome you to the 13th lecture in the Susan McDaniel Garden Design Lecture Series. The funding of these lectures and our truly superb garden collection is funded by Susan's husband, Maury, and her many friends. Susan was a longtime New Canaan resident. She was a knowledgeable and enthusiastic gardener and landscape architect. On the table in the back, on the left, there's just a smattering of some of the 350 titles from this collection, and I hope you'll take a time to look at them, and any of those books can certainly be checked out from the library. And on the right-hand side, the New Canaan bookstore is very nicely selling copies of the book, Gardens of the Hudson Valley. I am thrilled to have Nancy Berner and Susan Lowry here. When their book first came to the library, I was captivated. Nancy Berner has worked as a book editor and an editorial consultant for several nonprofits. She is on the board of the Hudson Highlands Land Trust in Garrison, New York, and the Glenwood Center in Cold Spring, New York, which supports community stewardship of small farms. Susan Lowry was a television journalist before earning a degree in landscape architecture. Both live in New York City and are longtime volunteers for the Conservatory Garden. And I just need to digress and say, if there are any here who do not know of the Conservatory Garden at 104th to 106th Street on Fifth Avenue, you truly, anytime you go into the city or go to the Metropolitan Museum, you just need to hike up a few blocks, and it's just spectacular. And come May 1st, they have 10,000 or so tulips that will be in blossom, along with flowering crab apples. So, their first book, Garden Guide to New York City, published in 2002, was revised in 2010. Their next book is this one here, Gardens of the Hudson Valley, and they are now working on a book of public and private gardens of New Jersey. My hope is that in addition to reading their book, you will be enticed to venture out to see some or all of these public gardens, and will keep an eye on the Open Days Garden Conservancy directory for the private ones. So with great pleasure, I give you Nancy and Susan.
Okay. First of all, I'm Nancy.
I'm Susan.
Thank you, Gwynn, for that introduction. Can you all hear me? Great. I'm especially grateful to Gwen because she had the idea of this lecture being gardens that included the work that we had done in New York City, in the public gardens of New York City, and the gardens along the Hudson River. And as I said to her earlier, nobody'd ever asked us to talk about all of them together. But it's such a good idea, and I thank Gwynn for it. The print that you see up here is interesting. It is done by a European in 1845, based on a print, or based on an engraving that was done by an English artist. The European artist had never been to America, certainly not been to the Hudson Valley, but it's a measure of just how important this Hudson Valley landscape was at this moment in mid-19th century. Both here and abroad, people's imaginations had just been captured by the best-selling works of Washington Irving. We all remember Rip Van Winkle, Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Well, these were great bestsellers. People were thrilled by the thought of what he vividly depicted in his books. And also the art of course, the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting that people were beginning to be very excited about. Landscape, and I think everyone in this room cares a lot about landscape and gardening. Well, at this moment in the 19th century, landscape was actually discussed in the most fashionable salons of the city. questions were being asked about, well, how did we want our landscape to reflect the aspirations of a very young country? We'd only been a country for a very short time. What were we going to do about our wilderness? What did we want our relationship to be to this magnificent wilderness that we had? How would we use the examples from Europe in our own gardens, our own landscapes? So these were all questions that were played out right here in the Hudson Valley, and I think continue to be.
And one of the things that Nancy and I think, what took from our exploration of both the Hudson Valley and the landscapes in the city is the serious play that design has had in that area, and looking at those designs and seeing how we would apply them to our own gardens. So the techniques that you might use at home or the way you look at your landscape all have roots in the history of our landscape in this country. And this period, especially in the 19th century, was where was the beginning of a really truly American landscape tradition. And it's where the American landscape, the ideas we have about the American landscape were formed. So it's very important, and it has seriously informed the way we look at our own landscapes. And I hope as you look at some of the slides today, you'll be able to bring some of those pictures home to your backyards here in New Canaan.
So I'm going to start with a little geography. You see the Hudson. I don't know if you can read the names of any of the towns, but I'm assuming that you know where New York City is, certainly. We're all the way down there. And the Hudson was navigable all the way up to Albany. And of course, after the Erie Canal, it was navigable to the Great Lakes, which made the Hudson not just a sort of convenient place for commerce, but it made it a superhighway. It was the commerce, the trade. If you look at old engravings from this period, the river is just thronged with boats of all sizes and shapes. Industry obviously grew up along the river. It would be unrecognizable to us today when we think about the bucolic river that we think of as the Hudson, to imagine what it looked like 100 years ago. Very, very different. All the gardens that we're going to talk about are on the east side of the Hudson, right along here. And we're going to go chronologically, starting in the north, around Hudson, New York, which is right here, and working our way down to New York City. I think that you're going to see pretty quickly that, in fact, these properties illustrate the story, as Susan said, of American landscape design, starting in the 18th century with the Anglo-Dutch and right down to the tip of Manhattan with the 21st century. So I'm excited, and I hope that maybe you'll save your questions for the end, I think. Oops, no.
Okay, how do I advance?
Right there.
We don't have many examples of Anglo-Dutch gardens in the Hudson Valley, but that was the original colonial garden. And for those people who have been to colonial Williamsburg, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It was based, obviously, on a European tradition of the Enlightenment, the geometric forms. Beauty was you saw beauty in organization and in straight lines, kind of keeping the chaos of nature out. It was an intellectual approach to the garden. This is kind of an Anglo-Dutch house. It's a beautiful Georgian mansion built in 1785 in Claverack, New York, by Hendrik van Rensselaer, one of the early Dutch families. And the couple that bought this house in 1975, there was nothing left except a few outbuildings, were inspired by these Anglo-Dutch gardens. And so they created kind of a contemporary facsimile of one of those. So there we go. So you can see the boxwood, the familiar paths, the straight lines. And in the backyard, This is a four-part parterre with a brick walkway. But what's interesting is you can see the gate and the little outbuildings. All the little outbuildings, these early houses had their, they had the outhouse and the smokehouse and this house. They were quite cluttered and very domestic, especially in America, where the houses and the gardens were much smaller than they were in Europe. So this is a very different kind of approach. The Hudson Valley was settled differently than, especially New England. It was, the Dutch awarded enormous land grants to individuals. The British followed that tradition. So instead of a country of small landholders, you had from the beginning a genuine upper class, a landed upper class, with the money and the means and the education to create gardens and landscapes about them. Even so, at the beginning, these houses, and this is a Livingston Manor, were working houses. This is Claremont. It's the earliest Livingston house in the Hudson Valley, and I should explain that the Livingstons were one of these great landholding families whose land grants descended originally from the Dutch and later from the British. They owned enormous amounts of land, and for 200 years, they were the most important family in the valley. In fact, by the 1850s, there were 37 Livingston mansions up and down the river. This house was originally built in between 1728 and 1732. You can see from the siting how beautiful, why the Hudson Valley, and especially the eastern shore of the Hudson Valley, was so appealing to people. It was burnt down during the Revolution by the British and quickly rebuilt. It's had the many Livingstons have lived there, mostly called Robert Livingston. The most important was Robert the Chancellor, to distinguish himself from his father, Robert the Judge. Robert the Chancellor fought in the Revolution. He was a member of the Continental Congress. He was Jefferson's emissary to France, where he lived there 5 years, helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, and was a partner with Fulton in the development of the steamboat, whose first trip up the Hudson parked right here at Claremont Landing. So you can see the beginnings of, though, a kind of a gentrified estate here. There are no more outbuildings cluttering the house. Robert had spent 5 years in France. He was very well traveled, he was very well read, and quite sophisticated. And we know that he began here the transition from to what they called then a newer style of landscape architecture. The newer style of landscape, which in the 18th century had taken over England, Capability Brown, the landscape garden, away with straight lines, and Anglo-Dutch or French-inspired gardens. And what they were looking for was a garden that took its lines from nature and its inspiration from nature. There we go. But that particular idea did not really percolate down to the middle classes. It was confined for a long time to the very few people who had been to Europe. For instance, we know that Jefferson and Adams both went to England and did a tour of these famous new gardens. But neither of them really brought those ideas, especially not Adams, home to America. It wasn't until the 1840s, the 1830s and 1840s, that a brilliant journalist and nurseryman named Andrew Jackson Downing, if you remember nothing else from this lecture, Andrew Jackson Downing. He wrote a series of incredibly popular books. It's hard for us to realize how important he was as a tastemaker, because garden writers are not that well known in these days. And his idea was to take the ideas of the English Romantic movement and this new style of gardening to America. He felt the idea of taking your inspiration from nature was, you know, the ideal motive for the American landscape and for the new America. And he did an enormous amount to proselytize it and to bring these ideas to, you know, a much wider audience. He died tragically at the age of 36 in a steamboat accident. He was only really active working for about 10 to 15 years, and he was on his way to actually design the National Mall in Washington when it happened. But he was from the Hudson Valley, and he used the landscapes of the Hudson Valley to illustrate his books and his talks and his ideas. And this was one of his favorite landscapes. It's Montgomery Place. It's a Livingston house. It's described many times in his different books as the epitome of good taste and rural embellishment. It's located in Annandale on Hudson. You can, it's a historic site, so you can visit. Unfortunately, the historic gardens, landscape gardens, which were all around in the edge of the property, there was a roaring brook, there was a stream, there were little incidents of natural incidents, completely looked natural, completely created. Our historic houses are generally restored to the last active gardener. So in the case of Montgomery Place, the last active gardener worked in the 20s, Violetta Delacourt. So the gardens you'll see now, you'll see the overall landscape with the kind of the landscape garden, no straight lines, curving drives, but the actual gardens you'll see are Violetta's, who was, however, very careful to preserve the trees and the historic landscape that she inherited. She was a wonderful gardener herself. She saved seeds. She was a garden writer, a published writer. This is her herb garden that she created in the 20s that is still kept up and really very lovely. There you go.
How many of you have been up to Olana? Just this side of the room. I don't quite understand that. So the artist, Frederic, for those of you who've been here, the artist, Frederic Church, was first introduced to the Hudson Valley by his teacher, Thomas Cole, who was the founder of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting. Cole brought Church on sketching expeditions to the Hudson Valley, and Church was hooked. He just thought he'd fallen into heaven. And as his fame grew, he obviously was able to sell enough paintings so that he could buy himself a farmhouse across the river from his teacher, Thomas Cole, just south of the city of Hudson. The farmhouse started out quite modestly, but it grew to be a 250-acre estate that he named Olana. This is the Persian-inspired house, which is at the very top of the hill, which he designed with Calvert Vaux. And Calvert Vaux, as I think will mostly all remember, was the designer with Olmsted of Central Park.
Also, Downing's first partner. Downing brought him to America.
Right. And I'll say that Church was very much part of this conversation that was going on with the kind of extending the conversation that Downing had started and then, of course, sadly ended with his death. But that conversation about landscape design, ideas about the romantic landscape, was very much continued, and Church was a big part of that. The visitors, sort of the experience that Church wanted to give visitors when they came was of the entire landscape. He considered the whole landscape, including the distant views of the Catskills, to be his canvas. So He created switchback carriage roads that would bring the visitor up from the main road, past kind of elements of surprise, like this lake that he created, where you'd see the kind of light and shadows. They would always, the views were always very managed. You would not see the house until the very end, certainly. But you would go past beautiful little flower garden that's tucked just below the carriage drive. And of course, this could not be seen from the house at all because the house had to have just the natural setting. And when you get to the very top, after this wonderful cinematic unrolling of the landscape, you have this sublime long view looking south. It was a view that Church, of course, painted many, many times. In the 1870s, when his rheumatoid arthritis had really slowed down his painting, he turned to perfecting his landscape even more. And it really became, it's considered to be the sort of outstanding example of residential American Romantic design. And I know for this side of the room, who's all been there, or many of whom have been there, I think you'd agree, it can be hard to see that on the ground. It's quite overgrown, but if you go back and you think about some of the ideas of Romanticism, you'll see that those ideas are very much there. And it's an iconic place to visit.
The Civil War put an end to the kind of Romantic era in American life. It was such a ghastly event that the optimism that had fueled these earlier ideas about landscape and the idea that landscape could improve you. This was an important part, that having a good landscape, a beautiful landscape, would make you a better person and a better citizen. It's an idea that found its fruition really in Central Park, and Downing's thinking really informed Fox and Olmsted about Central Park, which is the apogee of that idea. But after the war, the great part of the public moved on, and we moved into an age of making the great fortunes and the Gilded Age. So this is an illustration from one of Downing's books. It was one of his favorite landscapes. It's right beside Montgomery Place. It's a place called Blythewood. And you see the rounded forms, the simple cottage, the very appropriate size of the house to the landscape. I did it myself. And this is what replaced it. You know, we're in full Gilded Age. This Georgian mansion was built in the 1899 they bought the property, so the turn of that century. In their defense, the other house had to be torn down. But this is the kind of thing that is being built by the turn of the century, and this is the mentality. It's the Beaux-Arts. We're back to geometric lines, and it's an America that's newly confident and wants to show its wealth. So the ideas, European ideas especially, are appropriated into the landscape. This was built by Francis Hoppin, who also happened to be Edith Wharton's architect. Drew up the plans for her house, the Mount, and for her Italianate garden. And he believed, and is quoted as saying, a garden and a house should be designed as one. So if you think of that side of the house, he extended this garden down the hill. So it's clearly an Italianate garden with a lot of what you might call flourishes, but it's a turn of the century thing. I think of actually, the House of Mercer, the Age of Innocence. It's definitely a garden of its time. It's now on the campus of Bard College, where it's very much enjoyed by the students. Those of you who are plant aficionados might look at the planting and say, is that right? Well, it's not historically correct at all. It was originally a much more rigid Beaux-Arts planting, although, you know, it was always known for its old-fashioned, so there were always peonies and roses, but it was much more restrained. And there's always a question of, shall we go back to the original planting? But I sort of think that the ebullient planting, even the that grass, which is, I think, Little Bunny, which is really not a Gilded Age, plant, but the ebullience and the billowingness, I think, bridge that gap between the Gilded Age and the 21st century campus that's at Bard. And this is just a beauty shot. It's really quite a surprise to find this garden in the middle of the campus, which does stand, though, ironically, on one of the most famous historic landscapes of the valley. This is another historic event. We've all been here, right? This is the view from the Vanderbilt Mansion. It also was one of those landscapes that has been developed over time. It was the greatest landscape of the 1830s. And in fact, there's a wonderful map at the New York Historical Society of the river, and it has, you know, Newburgh, and it has it was owned by a man called Hosack, Dr. Hosack's farm. For those people traveling up, taking trips up the river. It was first designed by a landscape architect called, well, they didn't have a landscape architect, by a designer called Parmentier, who was Belgian, and he came to Brooklyn in the 1820s, and brought these European ideas to North America. He worked all over the country, and this is actually one of the landscapes that he worked on that's most intact, because the carriage roads on this side of the property still pretty much follow Parmentier's plan that I think was like 1828. So the original house was taken down, and Frederic Vanderbilt put up this Beckim Mead and White house. And he embellished the gardens, the Italianate gardens, to the, I guess that would be to the south of the house. But it's very interesting. We see here the beginning of what's happened so often in America, is the historic landscape has in a way been preserved. That naturalistic landscape, that relationship, you know, the curve, that inspiration that comes from nature remains. And so, for instance, this is Parmentier's original driveway, and Vanderbilt, when he just replaced the bridge with this is the oldest iron bridge in America, iron and cement bridge, but he retained the naturalistic feeling, even while creating really elaborate Italianate gardens to the south. This is his rose garden.
Actually, I'm just going to go back for 1 second. How many of you have seen the Bow Bridge in Central Park? Doesn't it look just exactly the same? Kaiket? Have we, both sides of the room, been to Kaiket? This is the entrance court, the family home of several generations of Rockefellers. If you have been there and taken the tour, you probably know the story, but I'll kind of give it quickly, which was that the Rockefellers did have a home on this property. It was a comfortable, it's always called a comfortable farmhouse. I'm sure it was a very comfortable farmhouse. It burned down, and when they went to replace it, what John D. Rockefeller said he wanted was just another comfortable house for his family. He wanted to be able to go and visit with his family, drive on his carriage paths, and play golf, which was key. He gave the project of rebuilding their family home to his son, who's always called Junior, and Junior had a different idea. He thought, you know, my father was the founder of Standard Oil. He's the richest man in America. I think we should make a place that is worthy of all that. So he hired a designer named Wells Bosworth, who was a Beaux-Arts trained architect. Together, Bosworth and Junior created what's often called the best, the finest example of a Beaux-Arts garden in America. And if you haven't been there, it is really a treat to go through it. Interestingly, the original estimate on this, I mean, I'm sure many of us in this room are parents. The original estimates were $30,000 to build the garden. When the bills were all counted up at the end, when it was all done in 1913, it was over $1 million. This was in 1913 dollars. It was several $100,000 more than the house itself cost to build. And I just really think about the father paying those bills. But he stayed supportive of his son, and actually when you think about it, Cabot kind of launched Junior's career in saving a lot of, not just saving, but creating extraordinary public places for us. Think about Colonial Williamsburg, Fort Tryon, the Cloisters. So this was his launch. The terraces around the house on the upper level are, of course, all hard paving and tightly clipped plantings, very, very formal. The gardens feel very private. Water is an element that carries through the entire garden, and you can see, as formal as these gardens are, there's also a kind of playfulness. Certainly in the little sculpture, you see the playfulness also in some of the lower, the grotto downstairs. The visitor kind of moves through the garden along paths, through terraces, up and down stairs, and there's this wonderful experience of kind of coming out of the darkness into the light, which you get here. Look at this gorgeous ironwork, which we had such a good time looking at ironwork all over the Hudson Valley. This wave hedge is clipped to mimic the shape of the hills in the background across the river, you can just see. Throughout, the level of maintenance at Cabot is to die for. It's just so extraordinary. A little discouraging when, for me at least, when I come home. So famously, Junior and Bosworth both hated modern art. They made that very clear. But Junior's wife, Abigail, was a great champion of modern art, and she passed on that passion, of course, to her children, especially to Nelson, who moved into the house after his father's death and brought along his modern sculpture. Another interesting parental moment. I think that it is this modern sculpture that is now all throughout the grounds, that the tension between that sculpture and these very classical elements in the garden are kind of what keep this garden alive 100 years after it was built. So just 10 miles south of Cabot is another garden designed by Wells Bosworth, exactly the same designer, also for a very rich man. It's now called Untermeyer Park, and his client was Samuel Untermeyer. At the time, Untermeyer Park was called Greystone, which you might come across as the name. So these were very, very different men. Bosworth took the same classical elements that he'd used at Cabot, where there it was all about restraint, privacy, very formal. And here, he took those same elements and kind of made a fantasy, just a wonderful fantasy showplace. Untermeyer was a kind of larger-than-life character, passionate horticulturalist himself. The property eventually became 150 acres, kind of sprawled all over a hillside. Famously, he had 60 greenhouses, I think I'm going to get this right, 40 fountains. They produced hundreds of thousands of bedding plants, which they planted all over this garden. The garden was open one day a week. Whoa. Sorry about that. What you saw earlier, this is called the Greek garden. It's a 1-acre walled garden, which is now still the kind of centerpiece of the garden. And on one end of the Greek garden is the amphitheater, which is where Untermeyer and his wife Minnie entertained lavishly. They were great patrons of the arts. They were famous for their poetry readings. They brought Isadora Duncan and her dance troupe there to dance for their friends. There's a wonderful story that I read when I was researching him, that Mr. Untermeyer had invited all of the delegates to the 1924 Democratic Convention to his house for dinner. 1,800 delegates. I'm not sure they all went, but they were apparently all invited. These were the days before very sophisticated weather forecasting. There was no weather.com. And shortly after the guests arrived, there was a torrential hailstorm. Destroyed the tents, sent the food flying, and the guests, in great panic, tried to get into the house, and Untermeyer didn't want to let them in, apparently, with their muddy shoes, I guess. But anyway, the party ended up being written up in the New York Times, which was entertaining to me. But the scale of this property was extraordinary. Sadly, of course, there's very little of all that glamour left. Untermeyer died in 1940. As you can imagine, nobody wanted this property. I mean, even his children, well, I guess starting with, his children did not want it. He tried to give it to the federal government. Federal government didn't want it. The state didn't want it. The county didn't want it. Finally, the city of Yonkers took it on, and they have struggled mightily to keep it going. I'm sure that the maintenance demands are extraordinary. It's now only 45 acres as opposed to the original 150. And it still has these hauntingly beautiful elements. Just recently, the last, I would say, 2 years, there's been a conservancy formed called, I think, just the Untermeyer Conservancy, that is trying to restore some polish to the gardens. So here's what it looked like last summer, which is very exciting, I think. These are, pretend you're in the amphitheater looking back at the entrance. That's actually the front door, sort of the door into the garden, and these absolutely stupendous weeping beeches. So stay tuned, because I think this will maybe once again be a pretty special place. So here we're going to hop back north a little not geographically correct, but chronologically correct. This garden, which is called Belfield, and it is in Hyde Park, just south of the Vanderbilt Mansion. It's actually now on the campus of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Historic Site. So this garden was designed at exactly the same moment as Cabot and Untermeyer. Same period, 1912, 1914. And this garden, well, I would say the other gardens really were so elaborate, so complex. They were really show places. I mean, they weren't places that any of us could ever imagine living in. But at the same time, we see this garden, which is of a scale that I think any one of us would be happy to live in this house and garden. So it was designed by Beatrix Farrand, best known for her work at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. You're standing on the terrace of the house now and looking south. And the garden, she used this wonderful forced perspective, so it seems actually like a much larger garden than it is. The garden had been given to the the Park Service in the 1970s by the family, but they didn't know what to do with the garden. They covered it with black plastic, but they didn't do damage to it. All they did was cover up all the plants, which meant there were no plants left 20 years later when a local garden club tried to come in and do something about the garden. when the garden club hired a horticulturalist, and together with a landscape architect, they searched and searched, could never find the actual planting plans for the garden. But they were able to take the plans from a garden that Farrand had designed nearby and use those as a template for this garden, for replanting this garden. You get to see the colors that she would have chosen, the planting, the groupings of plants that Farrand would have used. You see the beautiful symmetry of her stone walls against this very loose planting. Lots and lots of flowers, old-fashioned, beautiful flowers. And just as at Dumbarton Oaks, you see her lathing technique of how she attached her vines to the walls. It was always really important to Farrand that you see a balance of wall and vine, that you didn't just see vine-covered walls, that you got to see the beauty of the stone as well. Actually, these peonies were donated to the garden by a neighbor who heard about this effort, this replanting effort that the gardeners were doing, and he said, I think I have a peony that was given to me by I believe the son of the people who originally lived here, and he brought them over. So this is the one plant that sort of survives. And again, beautiful ironwork.
So here we have the recurring theme. So this is a historic landscape in Garrison, New York. It's the front of a house called Lisburn Grange, which was first developed in the 1850s as a traditional landscape garden. But in the 20s, Samuel Sloane inherited it from his father, and his wife, whom we call Kitty, was one of the founders of the Garden Club of America, one of their early presidents, and a passionate gardener. So she took the back of the house, she left the historic landscape in the front, and at the back of the house created a series of terraces. Very beautiful terraces with, once again, the telltale, the ironwork, which we became so fond of. It seems to have been a thing in the Hudson Valley during this period. So Kitty was a talented designer, but felt that she had a problem in her garden that she couldn't solve herself. We're talking about the mid-1920s now. And this garden, really you can see the evolution of how we look at our outside spaces, because it was they no longer took the garden as seriously. It was a beautiful place, but it's also a place to enjoy, to rest, to have fun. Humor was involved. It was the Roaring 20s. So Kitty's problem was this kind of lump at the end of the garden, and that stone it's actually a reservoir, and it was off center, and it ruined the terminus of her garden. The only male member at the time, the most prominent male member of the Garden Club of America, was Fletcher Steel. Fletcher Steel is one of the great figures of the 20s, 30s, and 40s in landscape architecture. If anybody's seen his work for Mabel Choate. And he looked at this, he said, I think I can solve your problem. And he sent them off to Europe, and he said, find me some classical stuff. So they came back with the statue and the pillars, and he created the second layer of the terrace and put what did he call it? The suitable deity on the top, and crowned the reservoir with the pillars, which I think are from Tunisia. And she had a very acceptable terminus for the end of her garden. This is a contemporary photograph, and the garden, the good part of it is the garden has not really been touched since that time. The bad part is it hasn't been touched from that time. So we have the true remnants, but it makes you want to get in there and rake and weed a little bit. So that was so successful, Fletcher Steel persuaded them to put in a pool. And, you know, especially during the Gilded Age, appropriating European ideas was very big. So he appropriated the dragon fountain at the Villa d'Este, this is a copy of it. This was their pool, which never really worked very well. And those rings were inspired by the rings that you see in Venice that the gondoliers tie their gondolas up at. And that was where, while swimming in the pool, you could hold and rest yourself while looking at the view, because that way, where's the thing? That way, this looks out onto that magnificent view of the Hudson Valley. So you can really, Fletcher Steel is sometimes thought of as the first modernist, but you can see that he has a completely different attitude towards landscape. You know, it's much lighter, it's much gayer, and it's much more anything goes.
And it's a private garden.
Yes. This is Manitoga. It's about 5 miles from Lisburn Grange. It's the home of Russell Wright. Does Russell Wright, he's the great industrial designer. He brought us, you know, easy living for America in the 40s and 50s. This is his house, Dragon Rock. He took, in the 1942, he bought a very unpromising piece of land on the side of a hill in Garrison. It was completely impenetrable woods. And he liked to say later on that people used to say to him, "Oh, you have such a beautiful garden. You're so lucky to have found this spot." He said, "When I found this spot, it was nothing. There were no views." And he spent about 25 years making one of the great kind of modern natural gardens. You can see he incorporated nature right into the building. Can you see the tree? The house was perched right on the edge of a quarry, which he dammed to make a splendid pool. This is a picture of the inside, and do you think you recognize the dishes and the cutlery of Russell Wright? He spent his idea of making a garden, he didn't like to add, he liked to subtract. So he molded his, I think it's 2 miles of walks and paths through his woods. He would go and he would look at a spot and he would remove the extraneous pieces of the landscape, take it out, to reveal what he felt was the essence of the landscape. Added very little, every now and again a few steps, but it was all very meant and very intentional. He was one of the first people to be very, very passionate about native plants. If he did put anything into his landscape, they were native plants. At the time, there's the vocabulary of the woods was mountain laurel, hemlock, smaller plants. As we all know, with the deer, there are very little hemlock, and with the woolly adelgid, and very few laurel because of the deer. But it still retains that wonderful quality that he had. He would find a spot of moss and encourage it, so we have these wonderful moss walks. And he would open up clearings into the woods, so you'd be walking along, and all of a sudden, you'd come to a point, and the river would appear. He was really the inheritor. You can think of, you know, from Downing to Church to Russell Wright, is that idea that you're taking your inspiration for the landscape and you're looking, you have an emotional, you know, reaction. Your garden gives you an emotional reaction. So just 5 miles away, built at exactly the same time. It's a completely different approach. This is Boscobel. That beautiful federal building was in the 1950s. It was a pretty intact 1808 federal house that was going to be demolished because it was inconveniently sited and it was starting to fall apart. And a group of preservationists got together and they persuaded Lila Atchison Wallace to fund the project, and they moved it from Montrose 15 miles north to a magnificent spot on the edge of the on the edge of the Hudson. She had just finished the Reader's Digest building, and the landscape architects for that building were a firm called Innocenti and Wabel. Very, very famous, especially on Long Island. They were the estate landscape architects, the estate firm of that time, which was the late 50s and early 60s. One of their techniques was they would move huge trees to give these new estates a feeling of permanence. So that's how we got this magnificent LA leaving to the. But it's interesting, this idea of scale. Remember, we talked about the Anglo-Dutch gardens and the domestic nature of it. So this was that era house. But the landscape around it is really the landscape of a Long Island estate of that period. Very beautiful, but sometimes disconcerting. This is the rose garden in the early spring with the weeping cherries, and terrific view of the Hudson. And there's a lovely winding path that goes on the edge of the south lawn. This is another moment. But at the end of the day, even if I find some of the landscape at Boscobel discordant, it is one of the most magnificent places to visit you ever will see. This is the view from the South Lawn across Constitution March to the river.
So just maybe 5 miles from 5 miles from Boscobel is Stonecrop, which is not on the Hudson, but we kind of snuck it in because it's such an important garden. It was the home of Frank Cabot, a distinguished horticulturalist who died last year. He was known, obviously, for he was a great plantsman. He was known for being a great garden maker. He has a famous garden in Canada. His interest was alpines. So throughout the property, you will see that interest sort of pop up. These were the first gardens that he and his wife, Anne, created right next to the house. They were the flower and vegetable gardens. Every year, these displays change. And the next project they took on was a huge job of scratching away the soil on a cliff, on a sort of steep slope that went down to a pond that they dug out and created this beautiful wisteria-covered moon pavilion. So the very, very special alpines are in special climate-controlled alpine houses on the property, but everywhere there are interesting plants. Everything is superbly well-grown. Everything is marked, which is a true pleasure, and go with a pencil and paper, for sure. So we've made it to New York City. We're in the Bronx at Wave Hill. How many of you have been to Wave Hill? Both sides of the room. Yay. So actually, Wave Hill was the home of Frank Cabot's wife, Anne. That's where she grew up. So that's a nice kind of link that exists in this family. Anne's family, Mrs. Cabot's family, gave the property to the city in 1960. And it was an incredible gift because it's like having a private estate in the confines of the city to go and visit and feel like you're visiting your favorite grandmother, I think. One of the first projects they took on, the gardeners took on there, and the main gardener who was at Wave Hill for well over 20 years was Marco Polo Di Stefano, who was is a brilliant plantsman and designer. So this is the wild garden. It's at the highest point at Wave Hill, kind of tumbles down a hillside. It's very romantic, very lush, very beautiful. It was based on the writings of William Robinson, the English garden designer, who kind of moved the English away from the Victorian stiff bedding plants into a more natural direction. And I think it's a great example of a wild garden. You can see why texture, for instance, was so very important. And this is where I learned to love Leonotis. Do you recognize this plant, this orange plant? Have any of you grow that lion's paws? Well, check it out. It's beautiful. It's about this high, orange, gorgeous kind of dusky orange. It won't winter over, but it's a great annual plant. The flower garden on the property, which is always full of inventive plantings. It's always different. They change it up a number of times by moving the containers around. The Monocot Garden at Wave Hill. Again, just like Stonecrop, you have to go with a pencil and paper if you love plants, because you're going to see a lot of things there that you will want, believe me. At least at Stonecrop, they sell little seedlings. Not true mostly at Wave Hill. Now we've made it onto the island of Manhattan. Progress. We're at the Cloisters, at the northern tip of Manhattan. It is part of the Metropolitan Museum. It's where they house their medieval collection, most famously, of course, the unicorn tapestries. The Cloisters, as you probably, I'm sure many of us have been there, it's a sort of amalgamation of buildings from the 12th to the 15th century, old monasteries, cloisters, parts of churches. It's all kind of glommed together to evoke a medieval time. And the gardens are the same. They're not trying to reproduce anything there. Oops, I'm sorry. This is the Bonfons cloister, which these are magnificent quince trees that are about so big. And you can see here they've tried to use plants here that actually they are sure were grown in medieval times and use some of the same techniques. It looks kind of like a page maybe from an illuminated manuscript, or I always think that's what they're kind of trying for. Just south of the Cloisters is Fort Tryon Park, which, as I said earlier, John D. Rockefeller Jr. was involved with. He was extremely involved with it. He famously stood there and said, put that tree here, put that tree there. It really, they're wonderful documentary photographs of his work there. I think the gem of Fort Tryon is this Fort Heather Garden. It's the second largest heath and heather garden in the eastern United States. It's enormous. It's the biggest flower garden that the city parks system supports. It's a little messy, but it's truly beautiful. I think that actually Frederic Law Olmsted Jr. designed this garden. There's a series of west-facing terraces, so it's a fabulous place to go in the evening. And there's a very good little restaurant right there called the New Leaf Cafe. This is just around the corner. Very close. Actually, this marvelous moment is followed by another great moment when the azaleas all bloom there. They have hundreds of azaleas. Galloping along, where Riverside Park is the next big green space. It's from 158th Street down to 72nd Street. The design for Riverside Park was kind of drawn out by the Frederic Law Olmsted Sr., the designer of Central Park. His ideas of the sort of winding paths and the big trees, the kind of romantic landscape, is what Riverside Park is. Within Riverside Park, there are lots of playgrounds and ball fields, but there's also this wonderful little community garden. There are 40 different plots, but all the efforts kind of weave together in a tapestry so that it's a beautiful display. Again, a great place to visit in early May because there are all these big trees in the background are all very sort of large old crabapples. from where Riverside Park leaves off, all the way down to Battery Park City, we have almost 5 miles of Hudson River Park. Now, you would be forgiven if you thought, well, I've driven down the West Side Highway 100 times, and that's not really a park. I see people jogging, I see people riding their bikes, I see people with strollers, but it is a park. And there are places, and this is one of them, where the garden areas are deeper and they're more obviously meant to be garden spaces. This is the one, we're right at Chelsea Piers. That blue building is Chelsea Piers. So that's at about 22nd, 23rd Street, I think. And the garden beds were designed by a public garden designer named Lyndon Miller, who's a wonderful designer whose work we're very grateful for at the Conservatory Garden, because she was responsible for the replanting of that garden 25 years ago. But you can see the use. These are sort of signature Lyndon Miller plants, the salvia and the red-leafed plant there. Who knows where we are? Right. So
Highline before.
the High Line before. I just thought, I threw this in because I thought, we've all kind of forgotten what this looked like before, because it's become such a sort of iconic, famous landscape now. But when the two young men, Robert Hammond and Joshua David, first kind of went to the community board meeting to hear what they were going to do about this structure, this is what they were trying to save. And that's what they created, which is just the most marvelous new, kind of magical new green space in New York City. I'm going to point out, I'm thinking, has everybody been there? Great. So this is the Amphitheater, which is so marvelous looking out over 10th Avenue. And here you can see the design, the smart thing that these two young men did right off the bat is they raised a lot of money. That was the most important part. This is a very expensive park. But they also did an economic feasibility study so they could show the city, this is how much money we can make for you. And the other thing they did was they had a design competition to find just the right kind of expression of what they wanted for the High Line. And the winner of the competition's name was James Corner Associates. And they really have kind of given the High Line the signature of what now we kind of think of, that's the High Line, using the old elements of the railroad that was there before them. You can see that really well here in the overhead. It now goes from Gansevoort all the way to West 30th and encompasses, if you've been there, wetlands, woodlands, a lawn. But I think what really makes the High Line are Pete Udolph's plantings, which this is midsummer. I mean, you just can't get any better than that. It's so beautiful. And I have been there many times in all different seasons. It's always interesting. This is late fall. I think I took this slide at the end of November. So it's a special place, and if you haven't been there, it's waiting for you.
One of my favorite things about the High Line is the way they use plants that in other situations we might think of as weeds, because for the High Line there are no weeds, they're just different plants. So that Rus typhina would be one of them, that sumac. When we were there the week before it opened, we got a little tour, and we came upon a very sad specimen of a tree that they were very proud of. I think it was some kind of spruce, but it was really a sad specimen, and they said, "Isn't that terrific?" We said, yes. They said, actually, when we were at the nursery, when we told them we wanted, they said, you can take it for free, because they're looking for plants that will reference the original life, that sad first slide. So a number of the things you'll see there were what you might think in a waste space that they're using to kind of evoke the past and what was originally there, but also there's a change of aesthetics that's going on with the High Line, right? This is a very different kind of landscape, and they're very different use of plants. It's much neater, it's much more naturalistic. So we're going to come back to that right at the end of our talk. But meanwhile, moving south, this is Tom Otterness's real world. It's part of a sculpture at Battery Park City. We have Battery Park City, right. So we know in the 70s, it's a big infill project using the fill from the World Trade Center. Nelson Rockefeller started it. The important thing about Battery Park City was that it was the first time in New York where teams of artists were used. So there was a planner, there was an architect, and there was a landscape architect, and there was an artist on every single project. So it was the first time that the landscape architect and the artist were used with equal weight in the development. And what's ironic, I think, and I don't think this is too tough to say, is that while the architecture at Battery Park City is, it's fine, but it's not breaking any, sometimes it's boring, but it's not really anything. The landscape is fantastic, so different and such a breakthrough with the artist's involvement. So here's the next. This is South Cove. And this is the first time in New York we see the idea of conceptual landscapes. It was put in about the 70s. So Susan Child was the landscape architect. Mary Mist was the artist, and Stent and Extot was the architectural and planning firm. So she's alluding to the past here. Those lights and those pylons and the remaining pylons and those verticals are alluding to the past of this site when it was a harbor, a working harbor, less than 100 years before. And the landscape on the side is an evocation of the original Manhattan shoreline. So we've really come a long way with these conceptual, it's a very big movement now within landscape, these conceptual ideas. And this is the first place we saw it there, and it was extremely progressive at the time that it was conceived, and it's lasted, as you can see, very well. I think this is the last park that opened, Teardrop Park, Michael van Valkenburg, kind of infill into all those buildings. This is his homage to Central Park and Olmsted's idea. You can see the greensward idea with the fringe of trees and nature around the side. And the idea, the brief, was to bring a little bit of the Hudson Valley to this park, to the people at Battery Park City. So they constructed this enormous central wall with granite taken from, I think it's somewhere around New Paltz. So this is one of our favorite gardens at Battery Park City, but it is very odd. It's the memorial to the Irish potato famine. And you really have to think of it as not a garden, it's a work of art. It's a unique work of art. Brian Toll was the architect. Gil Whitward was the landscape architect. Brian Toll, was the artist. And it's meant to remind us of the millions of people who died during the potato famine, and to remind us again that we have not cured hunger, that famine is still a problem today. It's 1/4 of an acre of an Irish potato field, a fallow Irish potato field, with the vegetation from the county Connaught and the remains of several houses that might have been on the site.
I just want to point out for scale, do you see the figures on the right side? That just gives you a sense of how
You see
big
where he is?
this is.
You see the...
Right.
It's like on a plinth, and underneath in the plinth there are sayings, quotes from the time of the potato famine, and as they updated, quotes from situations that are going on, of famine that are going on in our day. It's actually it's a little odd, but it's a very moving tribute. So this is the other side. But you can see the way the center really does evoke, this little tiny quarter of an acre of land, which was the smallest side a tenant farmer could have. If they had more than a quarter of an acre, they couldn't get any kind of food assistance. So that is all, any more land than that, and you were left to starve. And if you had land that small, you starved anyway. There we go. And there's a view from the road. And it's really extraordinary because when you go up, you can't, you're all of a sudden for a moment in an Irish potato field. And then you get to the top and there's New Jersey. Because across the river. So it's a unique but very interesting site. They've had some problems with it horticulturally, but especially in June when the eglantine rose is going, it's really very lovely. This is the last garden in the series of gardens around Battery Park. Goes about 1.2 miles. It's Wagner Park. It's a large, grassy, beautiful lawn with a great view of the Statue of Liberty, and these very tight gardens done by Lyndon Miller. So look at how, I don't want to say traditional, how beautifully these gardens are made up. You can see each plant is an individual but fits into the whole. It's very painterly in a way, but they're groups of colors, each plant individually molded, put into the whole. Right next door is the Battery. We're moving from a more traditional approach to the border to Pete Udolph again. So this spot actually, we began with the Dutch and we're ending with the Dutch. This is where the Dutch first landed in New York. This is the Staten Island Ferry. The Battery has been a kind of public meeting place since the time of the Dutch. After the war, after the 40s, it started a gradual downhill slide. It was a kind of a problem place where every 20 years somebody had a new idea of how to renovate it. But basically, it was a place where, vendors sold hot dogs and T-shirts, and the landscape, despite the city's best effort, kind of languished. 1995, a conservancy got together some very, very ambitious and energetic people, spearheaded by a woman called Worry Price, who's quite an unsung hero because she's done a magnificent job. And they hired Pete Udolph, who then was pretty unknown in this country. And he put together this new kind of landscape. A landscape, his approach to plants is not, it doesn't look at the individual plants, it's all kind of woven together. He looks not for particular varieties, he wants the plant that's as close as possible to its native habitat and to its native habit. And he famously looks at his garden over time. So he looks at the plant over time. For him, it's interesting from the very beginning through its life cycle to the very end. So he's big on seed heads and the evolution. It's kind of more a movie rather than an individual picture. So these are the first gardens that were opened. They were opened the year after, in 2002, and they're called the Gardens of Remembrance. The next phase was the Bosque. They took 140 London plane trees, and it was very dark, and they limbed them up, letting the light into the space. They took out the Belgian block, and they replaced it with a stone dust and gravel, like those parks in Paris. And he created these pools of perennials under the trees. It's very effective. But once again, you're looking at a movie over the season. So Some of the plants will be at peak and others will be over. And the whole effect is of movement, and he hopes of a kind of a naturalness. So I was once following him on a tour of ladies, a garden club, and they were walking through and they looked at him and said, "Mr. Udolph, how do you know when to cut down your plants?" So I edged closer because that was my question too. He looked at it and he thought about it and he said, "When I feel like it." So this is another view of the bosque. You can see how the grasses weave in and out. Fortunately, this magnificent site, and this is the late autumn. It's a wonderful place to come in the late summer and the autumn. Hurricane Sandy hit the Battery full force. But by some miracle, they lost 2 trees, and even though all their planting was covered with salt water, it all seems to have survived. Their offices, which were on the first floor and underground, not so much. They've had to move, and it's slowed them up. But it survived really very beautifully, as did the gardens in the Battery, too, miraculously. So this is our last garden. We started with the Dutch, we ended in the Dutch, but we're still working on that idea of American landscape, that idea of evoking the landscape and of a relationship with nature that Downing was really pushing us to understand. And I think he'd be really happy if he came today and saw what's going on, especially down here at the Battery. Thank you so much.
We're happy to stay a little bit and answer questions or answer them here, whatever you'd like, if anyone has any questions. Okay, thank you so much.
So
thank you.
Everybody